All right, good evening. This lesson is about soft field takeoffs and climbs, and it's a maneuver that we as pilots do to help us to effectively remove the weight on the nose wheel when we're on a unfamiliar type of runway surface. So, if, for example, any runway that is a soft field or unpaved or has any form of like grass or dirt or any form of neglected runway, we can still land there, but we have to develop the technique to be able to take off from that field and establish ourselves in a proper attitude to be able to get off of the ground. And the main goal is to keep as much weight off of the nose wheel as possible and attain a positive attitude in ground effect, and to help us to get off of the ground and get over any form of obstacles, or just be able to take off smoothly. So some of the learning aids that we're going to be using for this lesson is the Airplane Flight Handbook, the Pilot's Operating Handbook, the Airman Certification Standards, PHAC Section 5-11 and 5-12. The objective for this lesson is to safely and efficiently be able to take off from a rough, unpaved, or soft runway as soon as possible, get ourselves established in ground effect, and be able to climb out with appropriate airspeed. Some of the review items that I'm going to be covering in this exercise, in this lesson, is the normal takeoff process, so the student can have an idea of how to properly take off, and then we're going to apply the technique of the soft field in there. Another topic that we're going to cover are the principles of flight, very, very briefly, and just talk about the main components that actually associate with that form of technique. The V speeds that we need to keep in mind as pilots and have as rote memorization and muscle memory to be able to effectively rotate and maintain proper and safe airspeeds. And we're going to talk a little bit about left turning tendencies that affect that maneuver. Okay, so I just want to quickly introduce the students to what the normal takeoff procedure or process is like, so that way I can build a framework around how we differentiate the normal takeoff and the soft field procedure or soft field maneuver. In a normal takeoff, what actually occurs is when we line up ourselves with the runway, we apply full power, we get the clearance to take off, we apply full power. We're keeping our ailerons into the wind for any form of wind correction that we may need, while applying the right rudder to maintain the nose of the aircraft along the center line of the runway to maintain our heading or for our course. And we keep straight down the runway with the aileron pushed all the way forward, and we rotate in the Piper arch that I fly, or that I'll be teaching you guys in, and we will be rotating at 60 knots. And then we rotate and pitch up and allow the aircraft to go up in the air. And the way that occurs is by the lift equation we have here, where we have the coefficient of lift and also the angle of attack times the density altitude times the velocity squared times the shape of the wing, all divided by 2. And so what actually happens as pilots when we create lift is that we only have control over 2 different variables. We have control over the angle of attack, and we have control over the coefficient of lift and the speed that we rotate, or the velocity squared that we control. So what happens when we pull the yoke back is that we're creating a force that's more than the tail downforce of the elevator, and as a result of that, we are increasing the camber of the elevator, and by doing so, what happens is more lift is created from the downwash of the elevator, and the camber of the wing causes or produces more lift because you have high pressure trying to fight its way up to meet the low pressure on top of the elevator, and so we create lift less. So that's for a normal takeoff. And the same thing occurs in the soft field takeoff, but the difference is that in a soft field takeoff, instead of pitching up and just allowing the plane to continuously climb out from the runway, we lower the nose into what we call ground effect. And so what is ground effect, and why do we lower the nose and allow the plane to come into a state of ground effect? Well, ground effect is a change in airflow around the airplane's wing due to the aircraft being close to the ground. And what that actually does, it decreases the induced drag and it increases our performance. So I like to teach students that ground effect, the way you can gauge if your ground effect is if you're half of the wingspan, the length of the wingspan, cut it in half, and if you're that distance above the ground, then you should be in ground effect. And so, well, how does it really work? So the wingtip vortices they're decreased as the proximity to the ground limits how large they can get. So when we rotate, the wingtips create wingtip vortices, and because we are so close to the ground, instead of they dissipate, they actually decrease the downwash. So because there's less downwash of these wingtip vortices, so these vortices come like so. When we rotate, they come towards the back of the plane, like so. So the plane is taking off. This is the tail of the plane, and the wings. Quick little plane here for you guys so you guys can see. Right? And so what ends up happening is that when we rotate, the elevator creates wingtip vortices behind it. And that is what we call a form of downwash, right? And so because there's less downwash, because the ground is preventing these wingtip vortices from actually being able to flourish, because we're so close to the ground, what happens is there's less downwash. And so the air is not actually angled downwards behind the trailing edge of the elevator or of the ailerons. And so what happens is the relative wind is more parallel to the ground and it's not angled downward. So when we're rotating, the relative wind usually is perpendicular to the flight path. So the relative wind will be this way and the flight path will be like so. And what happens in ground effect is that instead of the relative wind being angled downward, as if we were coming in for descent, it's actually parallel. And so the lift vector is perpendicular to the relative wind. So as a result, your lift vector will be more vertical, increasing vertical lift and decreasing rearward lift, which is what we call induced drag. So the more lift you create, the more induced drag you create as a result. And while you're in ground effect, your induced drag is reduced and your performance is increased because you have more air over the wings versus while you're in ground effect, while you're in that state of ground effect. And so the whole premise of this explanation is to basically allow us to create more lift closer to the ground because we're already pulling back on the yoke to remove all that pressure off of the front wheel. You want to create as much lift and gain as much airspeed as possible. So you're reducing the drag and you're increasing the performance. And that's the whole premise of this. Okay, so I just want to break down the different phases of ground effect for you guys. So while you're in ground effect, you're going to have a decrease in induced drag and an increase in lift and performance. When you're leaving ground effect, you're going to have an increased sense of induced drag and a decrease in lift. And so why is that important to know? Because if a pilot doesn't really understand ground effect, then they might take off and climb out at a lower speed than recommended, and the aircraft can end up stalling. So as the airplane leaves the ground, the lower airspeed is really not enough to be able to create sufficient lift. And what's going to happen is the plane is going to end up dropping down towards the ground. And since you might be like 5-10 feet up above the ground, you can end up damaging the landing gear or striking the tail or something like that, or damaging the aircraft if you end up stalling at such a low altitude. Because in order to break the stall, you're supposed to really push forward, but you might not even have time to break the stall because you're such a low altitude. So it's important that you maintain your aircraft in the proper configuration, and by what that means is by just easing off the back pressure from the elevator. Because while you're in ground effect, because you're going to have a certain configuration of flaps, which in the Archer we put 25 degrees of flaps. So that's 2 clicks, 1, 2. That would be 25 degrees of flaps. The flaps and the effectiveness of the elevator is going to increase the lift component, but that lift component might not be sufficient enough because you're at such a low airspeed. So what's going to happen is the aircraft is going to want to rotate at the lowest airspeed possible. So instead of lifting off of the ground at what we rotate at 60 feet, because we have the yoke all the way back, which is a configuration of the soft fill maneuver, and the reason for doing that is to keep the weight off of the nose wheel. Because you have all of that that yoke all the way back, it's increasing lift on the elevator. And so what we want to do is just ease the pressure of the yoke forward to allow to prevent a tail strike, but for also to allow the aircraft to come at a level, stabilized, flat attitude to be able to develop enough airspeed to that way once we do climb out to lift above any form of obstacle, that we're at a safe airspeed. And so another reason why this is important is when you're landing, the aircraft might have an increase in the coefficient of lift if the angle of attack is not changed. So if no other parameters are changed, then the aircraft is going to float down the runway until the speed bleeds off, and there's not going to be sufficient lift to keep the airplane flying. Because when you have increased amount of angle of attack, you need to be creating more lift, right? Well, by increasing the angle of attack, you are efficiently creating more lift, but because you are at such a sense of decreased thrust or slow airspeed, then you might not have enough sufficient lift to allow the airplane to keep on flying. And so another caveat is that you might be overweight. If, let's say, you are overweight and you're able to land off of the ground, or you're able to lift off the ground, because you have a larger vertical component of lift, once you leave the ground effect, the vertical component of lift will be decreased and the drag will be increased, and that can also lead you to a stall. So those are just 3 factors of why that's important to make sure that you're rotating at the proper speed. Or I don't have to really call it rotating, because honestly the aircraft lifts off of the ground without you having to really move the yoke. If you keep the yoke all the way aft, the aircraft is going to lift off of the runway or the ground immediately, based off of the amount of addition to the lift that you're creating with the elevator and the flaps. So those are 3 important steps. All right, so I'm going to walk through the procedure of the soft fill takeoff, and step-by-step procedure of how we go about doing this technique. So even before the flight, we want to, the students should obviously go through the procedures in the airplane flying handbook or the POH, or if Purdue has specific instructions of how they want pilots to fly that maneuver. So please review that prior to. What we do is setting up ourselves in the proper configuration, and that's one of the cues in the ACS that we need to be able to establish in order for us to pass the check right. But also just to configure the airplane in a safe way to where we produce enough lift and keep the weight off the ground. So what we do in the Archer is we set up 25 degrees of flaps, and from the moment that you are about to perform this maneuver, let's say you're actually at a soft field or unpaved field, grass field, or whatever the case may be, you're going to have a lot of weight onto the wheel because the ground is absorbing the weight of the aircraft. So by pulling the yoke all the way aft, it reduces the weight onto the nose wheel and allows us for one, the weight off the nose wheel, but 2, the elevator is creating as much lift as possible. And that's why we hold the yoke all the way aft during taxiing and entering the runway. When you enter the runway, you do not want to tap on the brakes at all. You're not supposed to tap on the brakes. You want to allow the airplane to keep on moving. If you end up stopping, what can happen is the aircraft can lose its sense of forward motion, and the weight of the let's say the soft field or the mud or the ground or whatever it might be is absorbing the weight of the aircraft, and it can stop the aircraft from continually flowing or moving forward. And so we just want to have a continuous process. You're not going to stop or anything like that. Once you get yourself lined up, while you're still rolling, you want to apply full power and maintain directional control with your rudder. So while you're applying full power, we have a lot of left turning tendencies that will occur when you're at a high thrust or a high power setting and at a low airspeed. That's when our left turning tendencies are the highest. So things like your P factor and your gyroscopic precession and so forth. All of these left turn tendencies affect the aircraft in terms of wanting to turn the nose of the aircraft left, whereas that's why we step on the right rudder to allow ourselves to maintain proper coordination and allow the nose to be straight instead of the left turning tendencies taking us to the left. So we apply that right rudder to counteract those left turning tendencies while we're applying full power down the runway. The nozzle will start to come off of the runway, so you want to slowly release that back pressure. And why do we do that? For one, to prevent a tail strike, because as soon as the aircraft is starting to create a sense of lift and increasing airspeed, the elevator is going to want to lift off of the ground. And because of the flaps as well, what happens to the flaps is that we're increasing the camber of the wing, allowing more lift to be created. By doing so, the aircraft wants to lift off the ground sooner than it should. So at a safe airspeed, usually around 60 knots is when we rotate off a normal takeoff. But because of the increased lift and the configuration of the aircraft, it's going to probably get you off of the ground close to stalling speed, which is about 50 knots or so, 50 to 55 knots or so. So by releasing the back pressure, it allows us to remain in ground effect. And by remaining in ground effect, what happens is we have a reduction in induced drag and an increase in lift. And so by that increase in performance and by that increase in lift, we're now building up airspeed to allow us to be able to take off or climb out at a safe altitude, and at a safe altitude and a safe attitude. So next step is whenever the aircraft lifts off the ground, we want to lower the pitch and allow the aircraft to fly parallel to the ground surface inside that ground effects area. Once you get up to VX, which is a 64 in our aircraft, which is the best rate of climb, then that you want to pitch your aircraft and trim for 64. And basically what that does is allows us to get over an obstacle in the shortest amount of time. And once you get to a safe altitude, which is basically above the obstacle, let's say we have trees at 200 feet, once we get above that obstacle and we build up our airspeed enough by actually retracting the flaps and accelerating to VY, which is the best angle of climb, and that allows us to gain the best amount of climb in the shortest amount of time frame. In the shortest amount of time, and Vx is the best rate of climb, which is the shortest distance. So once we get over the obstacle, you want to lower the nose of the aircraft to build up the airspeed and also retracting our flaps, and that helps us to create a faster airspeed. And by doing so, we can now configure the plane at 1,000 feet, do our climb checklist, and continue on a normal takeoff attitude, which is climbing out at 76 knots. Okay, so here I have an illustration of the process and the flow of ground effect. And when I was a student, I always needed to have a visual frame of reference so I can paint the picture in my mind of how that maneuver should go for all our visual learners out there. So I'm just going to walk through the process one more time, step by step, so you guys can actually follow along through the sequence of events that happens. So while we're accelerating down the runway with our flap set and our elevator all the way back, our yoke all the way back, we're going down the runway, maintaining coordination. Then once the nose wheel starts to lift off of the ground, right? We want to raise the nose wheel as soon as possible, right? That happens. And the elevator is pushing us downward. It's pushed downwards, that which means that we are, the elevator is actually pushed all the way upward, creating more of that tail downforce is reduced, so the high pressure is taking us upward, right, causing us to lift off of the ground. Once we get into ground effect now, that's where we actually release the yoke to use that back pressure, allowing us to build that airspeed up and increase the airspeed, which is the appropriate airspeed around 64. So you want to get from 55 knots, from whatever airspeed that the aircraft lifts off the ground initially, and build that airspeed up to 64 knots, which is VX. You want to try to get as quick as possible into VX attitude in ground effect, where you have a reduction in induced drag and an increase in lift. And then you want to accelerate, which is the final step, to VX, hold that altitude, or hold that attitude and airspeed. And the attitude for that, I use a special cue. I like to pitch the nose of the aircraft slightly above the horizon or above the obstacle that in which I want to go over. So if I have some trees, I want to pitch the nose of the aircraft about 1 inch above the obstacle. And that helps me to develop a pitch attitude to know that I know for a fact that I can get over that altitude, as long as I maintain the speed of VX, which is 64 in the Archer. Once you leave that attitude and you clear the obstacle, then you retract the flaps, which is going to give you less lift. But even if you have less lift, you have more speed. So now you can trade airspeed for altitude. And you can trade altitude for airspeed. And so by holding that and transitioning to VY, which is 76 knots, which is your best angle of climb, your best angle of climb, and then you are able to pitch out and continue on a normal attitude out for normal operations. Some of the cues that are effective is as you start rolling down the runway, when you keep your eyes looking outside of the end of the runway. And so it's always important to keep that back pressure off and keep that yoke aft as much as possible to remove any form of additional weight onto the aircraft, especially in a soft environment where the aircraft is not rolling on a steady plane. It's bumping up and down. You have a lot of the weight being shifted from the tail to the nose and like so, back and forth motion. By keeping the elevator all the way aft, you're basically allowing the weight of the aircraft and the center of pressure to be more aft, keeping the nose upward. You want to protect that nose and the prop from striking the ground as much as possible. So that's some of the cues. Also, I like to use my peripheral vision while I'm in that process of getting into ground effect. And what that helps me to do is to gauge the distance off of the ground, so I know that once the aircraft does lift off, I release the back pressure of the yoke. The elevator tilts forward. I'm now gauging the distance between me and the ground, making sure that I stabilize myself in ground effect in a parallel and stabilized motion, level motion, parallel motion over the ground. And by doing so, that helps me to increase airspeed. How that happens is I'm reducing the angle of attack, and that helps to build the airspeed, and also changes the coefficient of lift and the angle of attack. Once you are off the ground, you may need to apply forward elevator pressure to keep the airplane in ground effect, which is what I just discussed. And also use trim. Trim is your best friend. Trim is what we call the poor man's autopilot. Instead of fighting the control pressure, so you have a lot of air coming towards the aircraft, which is creating a lot of induced drag when you're leaving out from ground effect into the VX climb. You're going to have more induced drag, and that's because you have less of the ground tube vortices, preventing that flow of lift. So as a result of that, you want to be able to use your trim to relax the pressures on the yoke, so that way you can focus on maintaining your proper attitude, so you can clear your obstacle, and as well as keeping a proper heading to make sure you're staying on course and not deviating left or right or into another airspace or into another aircraft that's around you, and it's maintaining a proper flat attitude. Use small movements so you don't cause aggressive accelerations up and down. It's very, very careful to when you're transitioning when you're leaving ground effect, and that process of leaving ground effect to where you're trying to clear the obstacle. It's a very cautious and slow incremental increase of the pitch attitude of the aircraft. Depends on the density altitude of the day, the temperature and whatnot, but most times the aircraft might lift off at like close to stall speed, which is 50 or 55 knots. 50 knots with the flaps down, and anywhere between 50 and 55, that aircraft is going to start lifting off of the ground. And so that transition to maintain the aircraft in ground effect is very, very important, to where you don't pitch down too much to where the aircraft starts diving back down to the ground nose first, but it's a slight relaxation of the back pressure of the aircraft and easing the elevator up to where that way the aircraft is level and parallel to the ground. The slightest incremental increase on the attitude indicator is important, but I don't want you to focus too much on the attitude indicator. I want you to develop the framework of looking for cues of how to set the aircraft in a particular attitude, to where you know, by setting this attitude, I can get the performance. And that's what we talk about when we say we're using visual cues to reference outside the aircraft and then see how the aircraft performs based off of that pitch attitude. And so, like I said, just placing the nose of the aircraft slightly above the obstacle in which you want to fly over is a good cue or good indicator that you're setting yourself up for success by looking outside. So once you do that and you have enough power, you're allowing yourself to be able to get over the obstacle by setting the proper pitch setting, and not overly being aggressive to cause any form of acceleration or de-acceleration while you're in that process. All right, so I'm going to walk through some non-standard conditions that can occur while we're performing this maneuver. Crosswinds. So when you're doing a soft field takeoff, the crosswind correction is the same. You want to turn the aileron into the wind. So if, let's say, you're flying, coming on the runway, you have a right crosswind, you want to turn the yoke, to the right, which creates the right aileron to deflect upward and the left aileron to be deflected downward. And what that does is prevents it creates a deflection of the right wind, the right crosswind coming towards us. And so that helps us to correct for the wind and prevents us from getting blown to the left, right? Because if you have a wind coming from the right, it's going to want to blow us to the left. So by putting that aileron correction in, right wing up, left wing down, it prevents that happening. But it's the same sequence and same process that we do any form of crosswind landing, where we make corrections for the wind. And so that will help us to basically crab into the wind as much as possible. In emergency situations, you don't really, if you have an engine fire or some other emergency, you don't want to really stop, you don't want to tap the brakes. So what can happen is you can end up getting stuck on the runway if you're in like a muddy situation or a soft field, with a lot of grass or dirt or rocks or potholes and stuff like that. But what you do want to do is close the power and just apply aerodynamic braking. And what that does is instead of keeping the yoke, let's say, all the way, instead of releasing the back pressure of the yoke to allow the aircraft to get into ground effect, you're just going to keep the aircraft you're going to pull the yoke all the way back, and what that does is increase the aerodynamic braking of the aircraft. And once you move the power, then you're not creating any form of airspeed, because the aircraft has no vertical movement. The aircraft has no longitudinal movement anymore. So you're creating more aerodynamic drag, and braking is what we call it, to allow the aircraft to slow down. And you're still not keeping your feet on the brakes. You want to keep the aircraft rolling as soon as possible and getting yourself in a position to where you can either taxi off of the runway and then get into a safe space to where you can shut down effectively. In an event where you might have to use a short fill and a soft fill technique, you would want to use the short fill technique in order to help you to get above the obstacle faster. Because remember, when you're performing a soft fill technique, you're going to end up using more of the runway environment stay in ground effect, right? So you have let's say a 3,000 foot runway, and you're coming on the runway, you apply for power, you're moving forward, and the aircraft gets off the ground. You still have to stay into ground effect a lot faster, a lot longer, and that's taking up more space. So if you have an obstacle very, very close to the departure end of the runway, you want to apply the soft fill technique as well as apply the short fill technique, but sometimes you might want to lean towards the short fill technique instead. So it's all about situational awareness and gauging the distance of your obstacles and understanding the airport environment, right? Sometimes we have departure procedures that we use, but those are really considered once you do get into an environment where you're flying IFR, for example, or something like that. We follow those departure procedures. But still, you would still utilize the maneuver of the short fill or the soft fill technique. So it just depends on how far away from that runway you are. From how far away from the obstacle you are. Excuse me. So we talked about V speeds. Usually, like in normal operations, we rotate at 60, climb at 64, and then once above the obstacle, we reduce the flaps from 25 degrees down to 0 degrees, and then once we get above that, we speed up to 76, which is our VY speed, right? Best rate of climb. And we talked about normal operations. We talked about the technique and the process and the procedure and some of the cues of the soft fill maneuver. And there's some of the completion standards. So in order to determine that the applicant has exhibit satisfactory knowledge, risk management, and the skills associated with the soft fill landing to be able to perform the climb operations and rejected takeoff procedures. So rejected takeoff procedures, like I said, is just pulling power out and allowing yourself to use as much aerodynamic braking as possible without tapping on the brakes to get yourself stuck in that situation. For example, if you do have an engine fire, you want to be stuck in the mud or stuck in the soft fill to where you can't now get out of that situation. So don't tap on the brakes. Just allow the aircraft to continue rolling and use as much aerodynamic braking and allow the momentum of the aircraft to take you into a safe environment. So that's how you do a soft fill takeoff and climb out. End of lesson.